Welcome back to Proxhammer, everybody. And today we're going to be looking at a Craftworld Ulthwe versus Greater Thurian League game that I played on Sunday against one of the people in my local gaming group. Great guy, competitive player, and new to Leagues of Votann. So he picked up the army not too long ago, not painted yet. Most of it, well, let's just put it this way. Some of it was partially built, but that's okay, right? No big deal. Both of us were using proxies of some kind somewhere along the lines. So we ended up playing a game at 2,000 points, and here are the results. Let the War of the Beard begin. So the first thing we're going to do in this video is we're going to do a quick overview of it. So we're going to be looking at the mission briefing, secondary objectives, and army lists of both forces. We're going to be looking at a turn-by-turn analysis of the game. And finally, I'm going to be disclosing my final thoughts, tips, and things to watch out for when playing Leagues of Votann, based on my experience in this game and the rule set of the leagues. So as for the mission, it's going to be a 2,000 point strike force game. The mission we rolled was conversion, which means that you have a diagonal deployment with 5 objectives on the table, 1 in the center of the board, and 1 in each table quadrant. So 1 in the center of each table quadrant. So this is a decent amount of objectives, not the most objectives of any mission, but a decent amount, and it didn't really have any negatives to it as far as advanced deployment or anything like that. So as far as the secondary objectives for Craftworld Ulthwe, which was the Craftworld I was playing, I chose Psychic Ritual, Scout the Enemy, and the Hidden Path. Now I don't have a Webway Gate in my army, but I thought that Hidden Path might be good because of the slowness of the Votann, and I was actually proved to be correct. It was actually a decent pick. Scout the Enemy is something I often pick in my lists, and Psychic Ritual, of course, is something I pretty much always pick, especially when I'm playing Ulthwe. As for my opponent, he chose Prospects of Wealth, which is basically an action that you can perform on objectives outside of your deployment zone. They give you bonus points at the end of the game. Grudge Match, which is a killing-based objective. Basically, you choose 3 enemy units and you have to kill them by the end of the game, or you lose points or gain points if you do end up killing them. And then the Ancestors Are Watching basically is, I believe, if my memory serves me correct, you get victory points for each unit destroyed that had at least 1 judgment token on them. If they had 3 judgment tokens on them, then you get an additional victory point for that unit. And if you kill the unit in melee, you get an additional victory point on top of that. So potentially you can get up to 4 victory points for each unit killed this way, although chances are you're probably only going to get 1 or 2. In the rare case where you actually do kill something in melee, you'll get a little bit of a bonus. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and take a look at the Craftworld Eldar Ulthwe army list that I created. This was a list I created a couple weeks ago. I kind of just was joking around about it first, just seeing what I could do with it, but it kind of grew on me over last week, and I decided, well, hey, I just want to go ahead and take it in this game and see how it does. It had a good, in my opinion, a good idea behind it, and I decided to go ahead and try it out versus the Leagues of Votann. So for my HQ, it has a Farseer Skyrunner with Faithful Divergence and Doom. This also has Seer of the Shifting Vector, and it's just basically a backline Farseer to just get command points with. Then we have a Farseer Skyrunner with Fortune and Focus Will, a little bit more forward. That also has Fate Reader. So Fate Reader gives me that additional strands of Fate dice per turn. Very useful on Ulthwe, especially over the course of a long game. And lastly, we have an Autarch Skyrunner with a Laser Lance. And his whole purpose is simply to give the rerolls of 1 to hit to the Shroud Runners, which will also be in the list, and it's a very effective way to get rerolls to hit for that unit. Guide in this list, there is no guide because guide is a little bit less efficient at buffing Shroud Runners than the Autarch in my opinion. So I chose to instead go with Doom. However, of course, Doom is going to be pretty useless in this matchup. As for troops, we have 3 units of 5 Rangers, which is the standard. They're just there to capture objectives and perform secondary actions. For elites, we have 4 Warlocks with Singing Spears, Enhanced Drain, and Power Enervate. That's 100 points. And they will be using the Webway Strike stratagem. Basically, the idea behind these guys was to deal with anything that was trying to threaten the D-Cannon platforms and give a little bit of staying power to my backline. We have 4 Warlock Skyrunners as well, with Conceal Reveal, Protect Jinx, Quicken Restrain, and Embolden and Horrify. The one with Embolden, Horrify, and Quicken and Restrain are there for the Psychic Ritual secondary, basically the trick that I told you guys about in a previous video, where one of the Warlocks, the one with Embolden and Horrify, goes forward, uses the Psychic action near the center of the board, and then the Warlock Skyrunner with Quicken brings that Warlock back by casting the Quicken Psychic power. And of course, we have two Warlock Skyrunners with defensive debuffs. Both Reveal and Jinx are very good at taking down armor, especially against a faction with pretty high armor values in general and pretty good durability. Okay, Future Self here, just interceding real quick. It is actually illegal, just to let you guys know, to run 4 Warlock Skyrunners in a match playlist. You would have to replace one of these with a Warlock on foot to break the rule of 3, which basically means you can't have more than 3 units of the same data sheet in your list. This had slipped my mind when thinking about Warlocks, so I would need to replace the one with Quicken and Restrain with a Warlock on foot. For our fast attack category, we have 3 units of 5 Shroud Runners. This was kind of the same build I ran in one of my Lake Talk lists with the Autarch. The idea behind this is that all 3 units kind of stick together if they need to be to take down a big threat, or they can separate and kind of branch out a little bit to take out different parts of the board. They also give really good versatility in that they can use the Wireweave Grenade Stratagem, as well as being able to negate light cover from units within 12, which is kind of useful in some cases, but not always the best maneuver because it does bring them really close to enemy units. And lastly, we have 3 D-Cannons of 3 for heavy support. This is going to be the main firepower of the army and the thing that I'm going to be relying on most in this game to take out the deadly Hecatan land fortresses. And yes, my opponent has taken 3 of them in this case. So this comes out to exactly 2,000 points. So let's go ahead and take a look at the Greater Thurian League's army list. This was a pretty nasty list, if I do say so myself. When he told me the idea about it, to be honest with you, I was a little bit worried because I didn't know if I was going to be able to crack through that much armor. He has 3 Hecatan land fortresses as well as a lot of other cool stuff in the army that basically is just going to be really hard to kill for most opponents. So let's go ahead and take a look at it. So for HQ, he chose as his warlord Ulthwe the Destined. Pretty good character, basically allows rerolls. He allows a unit to get an automatic 6 to hit or wound, which is really powerful. And he does a lot of other stuff. He's only 140 points, and he's actually really good in combat and has a great defensive ability, which basically reduces all damage dealt to him by attacks to 1. So pretty powerful and pretty good at surviving, as well as being able to buff the Hecatan land fortresses. Then he has 2 units of Borkin Forge Masters. Basically, one is the Forge Master, which is an upgrade. Basically allows you to ignore one of the damage rolls on the Hecatan land fortresses per turn. And then he has just a regular Borkin Iron Master for repairs. Both of those guys can repair. So if you don't kill the Hecatan land fortress in 1 round, they pretty much have the potential to heal it back, which can just be absolutely brutal against armies that rely on continuous or sustained damage versus burst damage. Luckily, as a Craftworld Elder player, we have some tools to get around this. As for the troops, he chose to go with the minimum amount, 3 units of 10 Hearthkin Warriors. Each of them has an L7 missile launcher, pretty good weapon to be honest, for 10 points, and a Magna Rail Rifle, which is probably the more OP weapon. All damage, if you do roll a 6 to wound, all damage that goes through doesn't stop at 1 model, so potentially this can kill an entire unit by itself. And lastly, he has the Panspectral Scanner to ignore cover, or light cover. For elites, he has the Sithonian Berserkers, and they are basically, in his words, just being used as a deterrent to stop melee armies from just overwhelming the Leagues of Votann positions and basically tie up the Hecatan land fortresses in combat. These are kind of like a counterpunch unit. Pretty good, 110 points. The great thing about these guys that I almost didn't realize in the game was that once they die, they can actually attack you before they end up getting removed from play. So very powerful counterattack unit that can essentially swamp up your troops and they're not that many points for what you get. They're 22 points a model base, and that's usually going to be enough to trade up into any durable combat units that you might throw at your enemy. For fast attack, we have 3 units of 3 Hernkin Pioneers with a high last rotary cannon. These are your anti-infantry element meant to steal objectives and take objectives early on in the game. And they have really good firepower. They're very powerful at shooting. They're not so tough. Even by dwarf standards, they're not so tough, but they do have a lot of firepower. And they are very mobile as well. And lastly, for heavy support, basically the main theme of his army was the Hecaton Land Fortress. He has 3 of those with heavy Magna Rail cannons, of course, and he chose to put the Mountain Breaker Warhead on these because he was thinking that he could use these to actually circumvent line of sight in some cases, which is a weakness that the Leagues of Votann have. Now, the funny thing about this is that this actually had cost him later on in the game because this replaces the Pan-Spectral Scanner, which, in case you guys weren't already aware, allows the Hecaton Land Fortress to ignore light cover on its attacks. So he chose to switch this out because he felt the Mountain Breaker Warhead would be able to take out a tank or 2 in the first turn or a heavy target. But we'll just have to wait and see if it actually does. Let's get right into it. And without further ado, the battle begins and Craftworld Ulthwe goes first. So this was first turn. We have our Shroud Runners deployed on the left side with the Autarch and the Farseer with Fortune and Focus Will. Behind the Ruin, we have our 3 units of D-Cannons, which honestly barely fit, but they fit in there. And then we have our 2 Warlocks that are going to be using the Psychic Ritual up front next to the D-Cannons right behind the Ruin. And behind them, we have our Command Point Farseer with Fateful Divergence and Seer of the Shifting Vector, as well as our 2 Warlocks with Conceal and Reveal and Jinx and Protect. They're going to be moving with the D-Cannons to be able to debuff the Hecaton Land Fortresses later in the game. Now, turn 1, I used my Shroud Runners on the left side to advance move and then move up onto the left flank near that objective over there. And basically I did this to be able to draw a bead on his Hernkin Pioneers, which are on the left-hand side of his deployment zone. You'll see those ovals right there. On the left-hand side, those are his Hernkin Pioneers. He wanted to use these to crush the Rangers quickly and go on that objective so that he could basically surround me. However, this just didn't happen. I moved my Shroud Runners up knowing this, and all 3 of my Shroud Runner units opened fire on his Hernkins and killed every single last unit. So the thing about Hernkins is they're actually very fragile. They only have a couple wounds each. I think they only have 3 or 4 wounds apiece at a 4+ save. So they're really not all that durable, and they went down fairly quickly. The rest of my turn was basically spent shuffling around the objectives, getting my Rangers from the ruins back onto the objectives where they should be, instead of being used as screens to screen out the Hernkin Pioneers. And the Rangers on the far right-hand side of the board moved up and advanced 4 inches to be able to get as close to that right side of the ruin as possible to potentially block his land fortresses from being able to move in that direction. And other than that, my D-Cannons behind the ruin just tried to shuffle outside of it to get better positions for the next turn against the Hecaton Land Fortresses that I knew were probably going to be coming my way. So, during his turn 1, he moves up his Hecaton Land Fortresses, and I think this is where he made a huge mistake. Instead of realizing that he had probably lost the left-hand side of the board when the Pioneers died, what he did was he actually separated his Hecaton Land Fortresses and sent 1 with the Sithonian Berserkers on the left-hand side of the board to contend with the Shroud Runners because, and we talked about this after the game, but basically he felt that the Berserkers could engage the Shroud Runners and kill them. Not really knowing how fast they were, he figured that he would at least be able to take the objective from them, if anything else. And this just did not happen. The Hecaton Land Fortress was really just too slow to get there in time. On the right-hand side, he moved his other 2 Hecatons on the other side of the ruin to get around that side. Again, I think this was probably a mistake. I think he probably should have moved all in one direction. But he basically moved this way, and he told me that he really just wanted to be able to engage with my D-Cannons and find good line of sight. And basically just in his mind, he felt like if he moved around ruin there, and then he moved forward in the next turn, he would be able to draw a bead on those D cannons. Unfortunately for him, though, it kind of doesn't really happen. He does fire his Mountain Breaker warheads at the D cannons, and here's the thing. I had known this was going to happen, and in the previous turn, I had saved 3 Strands of Fate dice exactly for the purpose of making saves. So when he shot his Mountain Breaker warheads at my D cannons, because I'm Ulthwe and I get a 6-up invul, and those weapons don't actually ignore invuls, the only ones that do are the Magna cannons, they didn't do a thing. So I automatically made my saves, and his once-a-game warheads were basically made useless. However, he did manage to kill a couple of other units. He killed the Rangers that I was using to screen very decisively. He also was able to barely draw a line of sight to those Rangers on the left-hand side behind the ruins. I had made a bit of a mistake and not moved one of them far enough, close enough to the ruins, I should say. And he was able to see it with the Hecaton Land Fortress and opened fire on them. Because he could see one, he could see the whole unit, and the whole unit was wiped out. So that wasn't fun, but a little mistake on my part. Cost me my unit of Rangers, and in the meantime, he moved up his Hearthkin Warriors from the ruin towards the center of the board and took out one of my D cannons hiding within the ruins. Other than that, he really didn't do much more, and that was the end of his first turn. Oh, and also he disembarked one of the units of Hearthkin Warriors from the land fortress to be able to capture that objective in the backfield so they could start scoring points on it. So my turn 2 came along. I still had most of my D cannons alive and 1 unit of Rangers left. I decided to move my Shroud Runners basically to the top left corner of the board to be able to draw a line of sight to the Hecaton Land Fortress on that side. And with the combination of basically 15 Shroud Runners with the Autarch with rerolls, a couple of Strands of Fate dice, I was actually able to bring this thing down. And many of you might be wondering, how on earth were you able to bring down a Hecaton Land Fortress with Shroud Runners? And the answer to that is 90 scatter laser shots, 15 Ranger long rifle shots, as well as rerolls of ones to hit, ensured that that thing was dead. And honestly, he probably rolled a little bit poorly. To be honest, he didn't have a lot of rerolls available to him because he was out of Uthar's range and at the time, I believe, line of sight. And yes, he did use a command reroll to try to help save it, but the Ranger long rifles themselves were probably the MVPs of this. Combined with the Strands of Fate rolls, I got a significant amount of 6s to wound, and his Hecaton Land Fortress was no more. The Synthonian Berserkers disembarked their 3 inches from the vehicle afterward as well. On the right side of the battlefield, my D cannons moved up into position and were barely in range of one of his Hecaton Land Fortresses on the right-hand side of the battlefield, the one closest to the ruin. I was able to draw not direct line of sight. I actually was firing out of line of sight, so there was a little bit of a penalty. However, I was able to use the Black Guardian stratagem as well as the Martial Citizenry stratagem to essentially ensure that a lot of my attacks hit, and 2 units of D cannons firing upon that Hecaton Land Fortress killed it pretty dead, and honestly with some overkill. So 2 units of D cannons firing at that thing brought it down, and I also killed 3 Hearthkin Warriors, in the center of the board with the D cannons that remained within that ruin in the center. My unit of Rangers behind the ruin on the right-hand side of the battlefield used to scout the enemy and just pretty much stayed there. And the Warlocks on the left-hand side of the battlefield behind those 2 D cannons you see in that ruin moved up, used the Psychic Secondary Warp Ritual, and moved back. And essentially that's it. I was in control at this point of 3 objectives, and I had killed 2 of his Hecaton Land Fortresses on turn 2. Oh, and one more thing, something that was a little bit embarrassing I almost forgot to tell you guys about. But basically, I used my 4 Warlocks using the Webway Strike stratagem to come in behind in his deployment zone in that piece of light cover you see on the right-hand side of the board, just outside of 9 inches of his Hearthkin Warriors to the left-hand side of the terrain. And basically what happened there was my plan was to charge in and either tie up his unit or force some of his units to actually go back for them. So I figured that maybe if I could draw a unit of Chthonian Berserkers back or a Forge Master or something like that back, I would delay his advance. Now, that was the plan, but instead what happened was when I charged in and made the roll with the Strands of Fate dice, the Hearthkin Warriors decided to overwatch, and they absolutely brutalized my unit of Warlocks and killed them outright before they could even charge in. Essentially, the Magma Rail Weapon was able to get a shot off on them, and yeah, that's all she wrote. Basically, he rolled a 6 to hit for that on Overwatch, and it eliminated 3 of my Warlocks. Rolled pretty lucky on it, and then he also got a few other hits here and there that killed the last Warlock. So Overwatch destroyed the unit there, and I was very disappointed in it, but I have to say it was a little bit funny, and you just have to laugh when stuff like that happens in the game. Probably a mistake. On my part, for sure, I probably should have just put them near the Chthonian Berserkers and charged them into those units. They would have probably gotten some more value before dying, but hey, you know, things happen. I went for a plan that just wasn't fully thought through. So I ended up losing my unit of Warlocks to Overwatch. So at this point, my opponent realized that he was probably going to lose the game, unfortunately. So what he ended up doing was he disembarked his remaining Hearthkin Warriors on the Hecatan Land Fortress on the right-hand side of the board and moved that Hecatan Land Fortress up. On the left-hand side of the board, he moved his Berserkers up to try to get into an assault with the Shroud Runners. Unfortunately, he was out of range, and even with the reroll to charge, he wasn't able to make it. In their center of the board, he had a little bit more success. He moved up his Hearthkin Warriors and shot at the D-Cannons again, killing another one. Between the missile launcher and the Magna Rail Rifle, it was just a little bit too much for that D-Cannon to survive. And he also was able to draw line of sight again on the Rangers behind those ruins on the bottom right of the board and kill them as well. So my turn 3 came along, and the Shroud Runners on the left-hand side of the board, one of the units with the Autarch as well as support from the Farseer were able to kill the 2 units of Chthonian Berserkers on the left-hand side. Basically, the Autarch was able to shoot his Laser Lance, his own Shuriken Catapults. The Farseer was able to shoot as well as use Smite, the Psychic Power, to be able to do some pretty good damage to them, and then the Shroud Runners were able to finish them off. My 2 other units of Shroud Runners moved into positions to destroy the Hearthkin Warriors behind the ruin in his deployment zone, as well as the Hearthkin Warriors in the center of the board. On the bottom right-hand side, my D-Cannons moved into the ruin on the ground level and started shooting. They were able to eliminate the last Hecatan Land Fortress, with the help of the Warlocks being able to use Jinx and Reveal on it. Although, to be honest, it was a little bit of a misplay on my part to use Reveal on the Hecatan because it wasn't benefiting from cover anyway. It was just something that I kind of wasted on it. So I should have probably used something else there, probably maybe thrown a Smite into the Hearthkin Warriors or something like that, but I just didn't think of it at the time. The D-Cannons moved up, they shot it, and killed it. In addition, the Warlocks that had moved up were able to use their shooting attacks on the Hearthkin Warriors in terrain and were able to kill several of them. The D-Cannon in my deployment zone's ruin was actually able to get line of sight on the unit of Hearthkin Warriors on the far right of the board, was basically only in range of one of them, but still shot, did a couple kills as well. And by the end of the turn, basically the only thing that my opponent had left was 5 Hearthkin Warriors, his 2 Forge Master units, and Ulthwe the Unbroken. Ulthwe the Destined. I don't know why I keep wanting to call him Ulthwe the Broken, but he is going to be broken in just a second. Now, at this point, my opponent pretty much, again, he knew he was going to lose, but he just wanted to play to the end anyway. And he wanted to pull off some sort of trick he had that he hadn't told me about yet. So basically, he moved up his units. His Hearthkin Warriors tried to advance onto the objective to capture from my side, but they were just a little bit too slow. And even with an advance roll of 3 plus 5 inches, they weren't able to make that objective on the bottom right-hand side. In addition, The two Forge Master units moved up, as well as Ulthwe the Destined, and they shot at the D cannons. Now, something I didn't know was the Forge Master actually has a pretty nasty combination with one of his weapons, where he can do a bunch of mortal wound damage with Ulthwe the Destined, with a couple of other stratagems and buffs. So he was able to take out two D cannon platforms by himself. Now, sometimes, in certain scenarios, he would have actually been able to kill the entire unit in one blast with this. However, because I'm Craftworld Ulthwe, I have a 5+ ignores mortal wounds. So all the mortal wound damage he was doing, I was getting a 5+ save against, and even with that, I still lost 2 D cannons. So he still dealt 10 wounds, even though I was saving on a 5+ against mortal wounds. So that combination is brutal, and it is something that I learned that when I'm playing other Craftworlds, I better watch out for it, right? I better not take it for granted. I definitely took that one for granted, and I lost 2 D cannons as a result. And to be honest with you, almost lost a 3rd D cannon. He also moved up Ulthwe the Destined. He shot something at the D cannons. Again, didn't really do much to it because I had Strands of Fate, a couple of save dice saved up, and that was it for his turn 3. My turn 4, I basically, at this point, tabled him, moved up my Shroud Runners, shot the rest of his units to death. The Iron Masters really aren't that tough. As far as their units go, they're pretty easy to kill, so I killed both of those. I killed his Hearthkin Warriors as well with the Warlocks. They were able to shoot, use Smite, and then charge in and finish them off. And basically, the whole army that I had shot at them, and one unit of Shroud Runners near the Autarch was able to draw line of sight to Ulthwe once the other units were dead. And despite his 2+ save, he failed enough saves to take out all 6 of his wounds, and that was the end of Ulthwe the Destined. So at this point, my opponent still had one more turn, but we just decided that I was going to just play out the last turn of the game just to see kind of what kind of objective points I could get and stuff like that. Basically, just kind of moved my guys on objectives, shuffled around, used actions, and counted up my victory points. And to be honest with you, I felt a little bit bad because I had known for a fact that the Leagues of Votann had scored very little in the way of victory points and had ended up getting tabled on top of that. But my opponent, honestly, was a really good sport about it. He admitted that he had made several mistakes in the game that had cost him, including in the beginning when he did not deploy his Hecatan land fortresses as forward as possible on the right-hand side of the board, which he admitted he should have done to be able to get to that objective quicker, but he was afraid of my D cannons and didn't really know what kind of range they had and stuff like that. So he chose to basically deploy behind the ruin, learning later, of course, that they have indirect fire and don't really care much about that anyways. And he also agreed that he probably should have put the Hearthkin Pioneers in reserve for later on in the game so they could come in via strategic reserve and be able to contribute some damage to the game as well. So looking at the victory points scored on behalf of Craftworld Ulthwe, primary objectives were 66 points. Of course, you can score a max of 45 with this anyway. And for secondary, I was able to score 37. 12 for War Patrol, 12 for Scout the Enemy, and 13 for the Hidden Path. So that brought me up to a total of 82 victory points out of the 90 possible. We didn't play with the additional 10 victory points for having a fully built and fully painted army. We usually don't play with that in our group in general, unless we're really practicing for a tournament and both of us are using our tournament armies. We usually don't do that anyway, because it discourages people from trying out new things and stuff like that. As for the Greater Thurian League, for victory points, they got 2 for their primary victory points. Now, they originally had 4, but 2 were taken away from the fact that they didn't control their objective in their deployment zone as part of the mission rules in the last 2 turns of the game. For secondary objectives, they got 0. Yes, 0. So basically, the units that they did kill from Grudge Match they did have judgment tokens on them, that's true. So they did score initially from that, but unfortunately, over the course of the game, losing all their units and not killing units that had many judgment tokens on them, those points were actually taken away at the end. So he ended up with 0. So in total, he only had 2 victory points, 2 for his primary objective, and 0 for his secondaries. So the other thing that me and my opponent talked about at the end of the game was how weak the Leagues of Votann secondaries are when you're on the losing foot. So there's very little ability for the Leagues of Votann to do a comeback when it comes to their objective game. If they start losing units and they start losing on objectives early in the game, they're probably going to stay that way for the rest of the game. They don't come back very well from being very behind. So some of my final thoughts about this battle was that basically my opponent's deployment and first turn movement was not optimal at all, which basically gave me a huge advantage on the board in the first couple turns of the game and basically put the nail in the coffin for him when I was able to essentially destroy his mobility on turn 1 and in subsequent turns take out his land fortresses one by one without him really being able to optimally use his Forge Master's repair ability whatsoever. So that was a big part of the list, was basically allowing those land fortresses to stay alive through turns and turns of heavy firepower. But unfortunately, in this matchup, it just wasn't really the case because he really didn't have the mobility to capitalize and destroy the units that were the biggest threat to the land fortress. The other thing about the list was that the magma rail weapons are very scary weapons, but not if they can't see you. And especially if they can't shoot at the optimal units, or if you can get a 2+ save to use your Strands of Fate. So, for example, if you are in a ruin benefiting from light cover and you have a unit with a 3+ armor save, basically after the -4 AP that the Magna Rail weapon imposes on your unit, you'll get a 6+ armor save, which is just enough to be able to make a Strands of Fate roll. And on weapons other than Magma Rail weapons, of course, at least Craftworld Ulthwe has an invul save. So Strands of Fate can be used on a lot of these high damage weapons, one-shot weapons like Magna Rails or Mountain Breaker warheads to basically negate the effects of them. So that was another thing that really cost my opponent in this game, was that his Mountain Wrecker warheads weren't able to destroy anything the first turn because I was able to use Strands of Fate for the invul save, and to be honest with you, they would have gotten an armor save anyway, even out in the open. Support weapons have a decent armor profile. And against the Magna Rail weapons, if you can get light cover, you are going to be able to get a 6+ save if they don't take a Pan Spectral Scanner, which was something my opponent and I also talked about. We came to the conclusion that in most cases, it's probably not going to matter, and the opponent is probably not going to be able to make a 6+ save. So it's probably better to go with the Mountain Breaker warhead against, again, most opponents. But again, Craftworld Eldar are not most opponents. So we did come to that conclusion that the Mountain Breaker warheads were probably slightly more optimal in the list that he had. But again, thoughts may differ on that competitively. I'm not too sure. And lastly, the Votann secondary objectives are really a bit harder to score on unless the Votann are in total control of the game. So another thing that we talked about was the fact that the secondary objectives, if you are behind in the game, are extremely hard to score on and very punishing. I mean, my opponent only scored 2 victory points and got 0 from his secondary objectives. That is insane. Most armies will at least, even in a losing game that they get tabled in, be able to score somewhere close to 20 victory points, even if they get tabled. Most armies are able to at least do that. So the Leagues of Votann, very unforgiving, just like their demeanor, just like their lore. They're a very unforgiving faction, and as such, their secondaries are absolutely unforgiving to them. A few tips that I picked up during this game as well is to basically use line of sight and mobility to your advantage as much as possible. Especially as Craftworld Eldar, we do have the tools to use these to our advantage, as Leagues of Votann basically have almost no ignores line of sight weapons. Outside of their once-a-use game, warheads, which they do have a couple of different types of warheads. The ones he used were the anti-tank variant, but they have some other variants as well that are pretty decent against other targets. But aside from that, the army has no ignores line of sight weaponry and has almost no mobility outside of their fast attack options, which another thing that I failed to mention before, but I think one of the problems with the Leagues of Votann going forward is that their Sagittars are not dedicated transports. They're fast attack. So that means they have to choose between using their Sagittars and using their Hernkin Pioneers, which can be a little bit problematic if the Votann army wants to be more mobile to compete with armies like Craftworld Eldar and Dark Eldar and Tau and things like that, they're going to be hard-pressed to do that once their mobility options are destroyed. Also, Strands of Fate can be used, again, like I said, for saving throws, as it negates huge potential damage from things like the Magna Rail weapons and the warheads from the Hecatan land fortresses. So, during the first few turns of the game, it might be worth it to save a couple of dice for saves of your Strands of Fate, because you will be able to negate a huge amount of their damage if you can get a 2+ save on your units. So I was running Ulthwe, which meant that I was able to keep 5 dice instead of the normal 4 with the Fate Reader, basically Warlord trait, and I also had 2 Farseers, so I was able to reroll 2 of those results. But whichever Craftworld you choose, you should at least be able to get a couple of those in the first turn with your rerolls of the Farseers anyway. So it shouldn't be that hard to get a couple of them, or at the very least one of them, to stop one of those heavy Magna Rail weapons or warheads from going through. And lastly, a couple things to look out for. Watch out for your charges. Make sure that if you do charge into a unit, that they can't overwatch you, because chances are if your unit has a judgment token on them, they can be seriously damaged or even killed by those attacks, by those overwatch attacks. So every 6 to hit is going to be an auto wound of a 6. So if they get lucky with something like a Magma Rail rifle or something like that, that can spell doom for your entire unit. Also, unless it's to tie them up or prevent them from going somewhere, do not charge something into Synthonian Berserkers and expect them to survive, because they can attack after they die. So don't trade melee units into them if possible. I was thinking of trading my Warlocks into them, but that ability actually deterred me from doing so, and I ended up doing something else because of it. They're a very good unit for their cost and can basically go toe-to-toe with almost anything that Eldar can throw at them. Regardless if they strike first or not, they'll still be able to get their attacks in. So that unit of 10 Banshees you charge in will probably die after they kill the Synthonian Berserkers, just because they're able to essentially attack after they die. So they're kind of like a Slayer unit from Warhammer Fantasy, if you guys remember the Slayer ability from way back in the day. And lastly, if you can help it, don't get near the Forge Master if you don't plan on killing him that turn, because the Forge Master has a nasty mortal wound combo that almost killed my entire D-Cannon unit within the game. Luckily, I was playing Ulthwe, which meant I had a 5+ ignores mortal wound save. If I didn't have that, the entire unit would have died instead of just 2 D-Cannons. So definitely something to watch out for there as well. So in conclusion, I think the Leagues of Votann look very scary on paper, but their lack of mobility and poor secondaries make them a really good matchup for fast armies like Craftworld Eldar, who can essentially just run circles around them and dog them at every step of the game. So with the exception of Wraith armies or Wraith-centric lists, most Craftworld builds shouldn't have too much trouble with the Space Dwarves. So that's going to be it for today, everybody. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I know that in some places maybe the diagrams were a little bit hard to read or anything like that, but I hope I explained them well enough. If not, let me know in the comments. I do want to improve the way I do those diagrams in the future. Let me know in the comments, and I would be more than happy to look into other options for that. All right, everybody. As always, I'll see you guys later. And if you do have any other kind of things you want to add in the comment section about the leagues and things that Eldar players might have to watch out for as well that I missed, go ahead and leave a comment. We would be more than happy and gracious to read your advice. All right, everybody, that's going to be it. Peace out. Have a good one. See you later.